Most people think they understand capitalism. They've heard the stories so many times it feels like fact. Free markets, small government, everyone chasing their own interests, and somehow, magically, the system works. Prosperity rises, innovation flourishes, society benefits. And if you ask where this idea came from, the answer is almost automatic. Adam Smith. The father of economics, the inventor of the free market, the man who taught us to trust the invisible hand. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The version of Adam Smith we quote today would have terrified the real Adam Smith. Because the man modern capitalism worships is not the man who actually wrote the books. In fact, many of the people who invoke his name are doing exactly what he warned against. To understand why, we need to forget the slogans and go back to the world Adam Smith actually lived in. Adam Smith was born in 1723 in Scotland, not into prosperity, but into a rigid, unequal society where your birth mattered more than your talent. This was not an age of free markets. It was an age of mercantilism. Trade was controlled by royal charters, entire industries were dominated by guilds and cartels, prices were fixed, competition was limited, and global commerce was ruled by massive monopolies. The most powerful of them all was the East India Company, a corporation so large it didn't just trade goods, it ruled territory, it commanded armies, it shaped governments. This was not capitalism as we imagine it today. It was corporate power fused directly to political power. And this is the world Adam Smith studied. Not an idealized market, not a theoretical model, but a system where economic rules were written by the people who benefited most from them. Smith wasn't blind to this. He was alarmed by it. He famously wrote that people of the same trade rarely gather together without the conversation ending in a conspiracy against the public. In plain language, when powerful business interests get together, society usually pays the price. That line alone should make us pause, because it doesn't sound like blind faith in markets. It sounds like a warning. Another thing most people don't realize, Adam Smith was not trained as an economist. He didn't even think of himself as one. He was a moral philosopher. Before The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a book about empathy, fairness, and the psychological foundations of human behavior. Smith believed that societies only function when people possess moral restraint, when sympathy, social norms, and shared responsibility limit selfish behavior. He did not believe greed was a reliable organizing principle. He believed unchecked self-interest was dangerous. Markets, in Smith's view, were human creations, not natural laws. And because humans are flawed, markets would always need rules. Which brings us to the most misunderstood idea in all of economics, the invisible hand. Today, the invisible hand is treated like a universal force, as if markets automatically self-correct, reward virtue, and punish excess. But Adam Smith barely used the phrase at all. Across everything he ever wrote, he mentioned it only 3 times. 3. And not once did he describe it as a general law of economics. Not once did he argue that deregulation leads to harmony. Not once did he claim markets naturally produce fairness. Each use meant something very different and far more limited than what we hear today. The first appearance isn't even about economics. It comes from an early essay on astronomy, where Smith uses the invisible hand to describe how ancient people explained things they didn't understand, storms, disasters, randomness, by imagining gods pulling hidden strings. It was about superstition. Human beings invent invisible forces to feel comfortable with chaos. Ironically, that may be the most accurate use of the phrase in modern economics. The second use appears in The Wealth of Nations, and this is the one everyone quotes, usually without context. Smith describes a merchant who chooses to invest domestically rather than overseas, not because he's noble, not because he's patriotic, not because he's enlightened, but because he's afraid.
Foreign trade feels risky, unfamiliar, unstable, so he keeps his money closer to home, and domestic industry benefits as a side effect. That's it. No grand principle, no moral lesson, just fear accidentally producing a public benefit. Smith never said this would always happen. He never claimed it was reliable. He presented it as a narrow, situational outcome, not a rule to build an entire system around. But later economists needed a slogan, so a footnote became a doctrine. The third and final use of the invisible hand appears in the theory of moral sentiments, and it's the most revealing of all. Smith describes wealthy landowners who hoard enormous resources. They are vain, self-absorbed, obsessed with luxury. But even despite their greed, they still end up supporting others, not because they want to, but because they physically can't consume everything themselves. A person can own thousands of acres, but can only eat one meal at a time. So laborers survive on the leftovers. That, Smith says, is the invisible hand. Not generosity, not justice, just the limits of human appetite. It's not praise, it's a bleak observation. The poor survive not because the rich are kind, but because even greed has biological constraints. That is the invisible hand modern capitalism celebrates: fear, superstition, and the limits of gluttony. Hardly a divine economic law. So how did this narrow metaphor become the foundation of modern ideology? Because it was useful. As industrial giants rose in the 19th century, railroads, steel trusts, oil empires, they needed justification for enormous power. Regulation threatened profits, public oversight threatened control. So they reached for philosophy. They stripped Adam Smith of his moral framework, ignored his warnings, and turned a cautious thinker into a mascot for laissez-faire ideology. Later, during the Cold War, this simplified version of Smith became even more valuable. Capitalism needed a moral counterweight to communism, a story where markets weren't just efficient, but virtuous. And so the invisible hand was reborn, not as a metaphor, but as a mandate. Government was framed as the problem, regulation as distortion, corporate power as freedom. Never mind that Smith explicitly warned about monopolies. Never mind that he feared corporations gaining political influence. Never mind that he supported government intervention in education, infrastructure, banking, and public goods. Those parts were inconvenient, so they were forgotten. What Adam Smith actually feared looks eerily familiar today. Corporations large enough to shape laws, markets dominated by a handful of players, economic outcomes that appear natural but are carefully engineered. Smith believed markets collapse when power concentrates. He argued that competition requires enforcement, and he understood that without oversight, private interests will always bend rules in their favor. In other words, markets don't fail because of too much government. They fail because of too little restraint on power. When we look at modern tech monopolies, financial institutions deemed too big to fail, and corporations that influence policy across borders, we are not witnessing free markets. We are witnessing exactly what Adam Smith warned about: cartels with better branding. The greatest irony is this: modern capitalism treats the invisible hand as a comforting force, a promise that things will work out on their own. But Adam Smith used it to describe accidents, limitations, and illusions. He never believed markets would save us. He believed people had to govern themselves, morally and politically, to prevent abuse. Markets, to Smith, were tools, not gods. They required rules. They required balance. They required a society willing to confront concentrated power. Adam Smith didn't offer reassurance. He offered responsibility. And the tragedy of his legacy isn't that he was misunderstood, it's that his warnings were ignored. History doesn't punish ignorance immediately. It waits, and then it collects.